Welcome everybody to this number 3, that is third of the online IIT Theoretical Ecology seminars. Today we're going to have Vadim Karatayev presenting about species heterogeneity and alternative stable states in food webs. And without further ado, I will give him the floor now. So thank you very much.
Okay, so let's see how this works. Okay. So you're seeing one slide?
Great. Yes.
All right, great. Well, thank you, and thank you everyone so much for coming. I think IIT is like kind of one of the truly really great things to emerge from COVID, especially for those of us that are on the other side of the pond, and also those of us that are, the one theoretician on the department. So it's really wonderful to get together with some peeps. So I'm going to be talking about some work I did for my PhD with my advisor Marissa Basket at University of California, Davis, and also with Egbert van Ness and Martin Scheffer at Wageningen. And so as a PhD student, I was studying kind of this question of alternative stable states and biologically complex and realistic ecosystems. And of course, one of the things you kind of run into almost instantly is that the typical models we use to study ecological dynamics are kind of nice and simple, where you can understand things. So for instance, maybe you have one model of alternative stable states where you have a predator eating a prey, but then the prey also eats the larvae of the predator. Okay, so you have like 2 or 3 dynamical variables there. It's great, except the reality looks a little bit more like this. And so in particular, one of the issues you might have is that the 2 species you're looking at are actually embedded in this much broader network, food web network, and they're actually, each of them is interacting with many different species. So those kind of interactions are getting diluted across the food web network. And I have to point out, this is a really, really old question in theoretical ecology with a really interesting literature. Here I'm going to be pointing out a few of the key papers that really talk about this, so some of the really interesting stuff. So this is one of the problems we have with using really few species models. Another approach we can take is say, okay, well, actually we're kind of modeling in these variables, we're kind of lumping together and aggregating entire functional groups or trophic levels and looking at it that way. So then the problem with this kind of aggregation, if you're kind of aggregating vertically across a food chain or state structure in a population, and they're kind of isolated from the rest of the system, you can sort of do okay with predicting steady states. You might miss the transient or non-equilibrium dynamics because the structure of time lags is getting wonky, or you're losing it. And then if you're aggregating kind of horizontally across a functional group where you have different species with different turnover rates or interacting with different things, you might even predict the steady states wrong. And I should specify, I'm just talking about here nonlinear ecological models, so the ones we're using most of the time. But this issue of potentially getting steady states wrong is quite concerning when we're thinking about things like alternative stable states. Okay, and so in particular, what I want to focus on is, given the potential that food web networks have to distribute feedback loops across many different species, when might we have ecosystems exhibiting the alternative stable states that we're predicting in few species or more aggregated models? So when are those predictions? When might those predictions pan out? Looking at multi-species models of multiple stable states is also surprisingly quite an old question, where people have really looked at quite complex models with mutualism and competition and some really clever studies. So one of the regularities that you see in, so have really nice canonical models of competition and mutualism. One of the patterns that you see is often, though, if you have a lot of different species, you start to see kind of clusters emerging of kind of super species, where you have one competing cluster and one cluster of alternative species. And so you have these competition across between these mega clusters. One really nice way to visualize this, so you tend to either minimize competition or maximize facilitation within these species clusters. And one of the kind of really cool ways to visualize this is if you have a niche axis, of competitors, you might actually see clumps of species. So there's minimal competition within the clump, maximal competition between clumps. So that's kind of one of the really fun insights from that. And I think Yuri is working on some really interesting evolution problems related to this. And though there's still kind of the question left about what happens as we start to think not kind of just resources or plant pollinator species in an ecosystem, but the upper trophic level. So the consumers that potentially compete with one another quite a bit, but also have the potential for indirect facilitation. Before we get to that though, while we're still thinking about these really simple models, I want to use kind of one of the perks of giving a talk to a theoretical audience and give you kind of a really simple model that kind of encapsulates the key idea and the key finding here that I think is quite interesting. And that is, let's think about kind of a multi-species allele effect. So we have two species mildly competing. One is more sensitive to, one is more vulnerable to stress and collapses first. Right, so how does the loss of one species affect the other? One option is maybe this allele function is linear, so like an average of the species densities. So they're helping each other in the same way. And then if we lose one species, you might get a mild decline in the other. And the other extreme is if it's a nonlinear function, like the minimum of those two densities. For instance, each species is providing a key limiting nutrient or alleviating a key stressor. Then as we lose one species, we might see the other one collapse as well. Okay, so then the persistence of the entire community of two species really depends on the weakest species being there. And as soon as you lose it, the rest of the system might collapse as well. Okay, so one of the issues when we start thinking about broadly alternative stable states in food webs, one of the issues is that we've been studying this idea of consumer collapse in very different systems using very different models or very different field techniques. So in all of these cases, you have the two states are either the consumer and the resources present, or we have only the resource species present with the consumer extinct. And if we look at across all these studies, we see kind of two really common regularities in all these different mechanisms. And that is that when resources become abundant, they either deplete the recruitment of the consumer, or the resource itself becomes hard to use, or the depleting energy uptake. So kind of as a very broad sketch, consumer feeding or recruitment decline with resource density. So two systems I kind of want maybe to keep in mind as we're thinking about this, where kind of you have truly really high diversity, are herbivore assemblages on coral reefs, and those herbivores eat macroalgae, and the rockfish communities of California rocky reefs, where here's a kind of a table of the 16 common species. There's really diverse systems. And so in these systems, fishing is quite important. It can deplete consumer abundance and therefore reduce total herbivory or predation. So on coral reefs, one of the things that can cause is that algae then survive to an older age, where they're less nutritious, even the individual leaves are less nutritious as they get older, or they form dense plants, stands that harbor predators, so increased predation risk. At the same time, we also know that macroalgae can overgrow corals, and corals are really important in sheltering and attracting larval herbivores. So similarly on rocky reefs, as we get lower predation, that means more prey fish species can survive to a larger body size when they're too big to eat. And also all the different predator species all go through kind of a similar early life stage, so larvae or eggs, where they're all vulnerable to eating by many different prey species. From now on, though, I want to kind of focus on, or assume kind of really fast turnover in the juvenile stages, so kind of a slightly simpler model, and just focus on, so this is kind of assuming that feeding and recruitment adjust quickly to changes in consumer and resource abundance, so timescale separation there. And also just focus on two trophic levels within a food web. And then we can use multiple food web realizations with different species traits and different food web networks to account for robustness. And we're going to be omitting the non-feasible food webs where you we don't have a diverse consumer assemblage to start with at low mortality levels. And then we're going to be focusing on what's happening as we crank up the mortality that all consumers are experiencing. So you'll see the basic structure of this is just a really simple logic of Altera predator-prey. And within this, there's several ways that species can differ from one another. One is demography, and the key result of that is that as we gradually increase mortality, some species will collapse before others. The second one is diet. And the key here is that as we'll look at different levels of food web connectance, we're holding total consumption constant across connectance levels. So we really want to make sure that network structure isn't also affecting biological rates or biological constraints. And of course, finally, we're comparing two models that differ only in the feedbacks, where with the feeding feedback, an abundant resource becomes hard for everyone to eat. So first, let's look at what this model difference could mean conceptually. Specifically, let's think at what happens when we lose a consumer species. Okay, so because consumers divide their feeding across multiple resources, without consumer 2, the remaining consumers might not be able to maintain resource 2 at a low enough abundance to be edible. And so energy uptake for the remaining consumers can decline. And in the model dynamics, if we look at the critical level, when we remove that consumer, we see a sequence of that leading to a sequence of cascading consumer declines and loss of the entire guild. So because there are biological limits on how any individual consumer, how much they can control any one resource, and the fact that individual resources become inedible once they're abundant, if we think of kind of a classic biodiversity ecosystem function framework, each consumer has a more specialized role in keeping up the energy uptake of the consumer guild. Now, for recruitment feedbacks, we have, again, many different consumers dying as recruits, either directly or indirectly, from interactions with all the different resource species. And this can also happen indirectly when the resources deplete a key habitat forming species. So overall, recruitment mostly just depends on total resource abundance, and all consumer species help limit total resource abundance. So then we can think about, first actually look at how species richness in these models affects ecological functioning with consumer removal experiments. So this is just looking at a low mortality level. So then we see that recruit survival averaged across all consumer species really drops off when we lose the last few species. And the shaded area here is variation across the 80 food web realizations. But average edibility averaged across all resource species declines more in proportion to the number of consumers we have left. So at higher mortality levels, where the entire consumer guild might collapse once ecological functioning becomes too low, we see that we cross that threshold when we lose fewer of the vulnerable species with feeding feedbacks compared with the recruitment feedbacks. Okay, so now we can look at an actual bifurcation diagram. So here we're gradually ramping up mortality. We see that with recruitment feedbacks, the entire consumer guild collapses at a critical point, and then recovery requires a very large reduction in mortality. For feeding feedbacks, we see the whole consumer guild collapses at a lower mortality level, but it also recovers after a small reduction in mortality. So overall, alternative stable states happen over a much smaller range of conditions with feeding feedbacks. And the last thing I want to look at is what happens across the full range of food web connectance levels. So from here on, I'm just going to be looking at the points, mortality levels at which the median consumer species collapse and recover. And first for recruitment feedbacks, so across the full range of connectance levels, we have these points of collapse and median points of recovery. So between these points, we have alternative stable states happening in most consumer species. And so we see that that range of conditions leading to alternative stable states increases as we increase connectance. And so the key reason for this is that in a food web, you have kind of this variation. Some consumers have higher grazing rates, some consumers have higher recruitment rates, and they're more abundant. And as we increase connectance, just that structure of the network, those dominant consumers can now control a greater fraction of all resources. So just by changing the connectance, we're increasing the total amount of top-down control, and that strengthens the recruitment feedback loop. For feeding feedbacks, we actually see the opposite trend, where the collapse point starts declining as we increase consumer connectance levels. And one of the key things we can look at is the point at which the last consumer species tends to collapse, and the point at which the first or the weakest consumer species collapses. And what we see is that at a high connectance, those two thresholds converge on each other. And so the key insight here is that even with all this high connectance and kind of everyone having similar diets, at high connectance and mortality, even the dominant consumers need most of the resources to be edible in order to persist. And they can't do that by themselves without the presence of the more vulnerable species as well. So then persistence of the entire consumer guild increasingly depends on persistence of the most vulnerable species. So kind of going back to that weakest link idea. So putting this all together, one thing I want to emphasize is that alternative stable states can happen in really diverse systems, and they're more likely to happen when species improve conditions in really similar ways. And so, for instance, when you have many different herbivore species all promoting increasing coral cover on a coral reef. But there's, again, to emphasize, there's this really wide range of mechanisms that we've highlighted in the literature that can lead to this. And so then we have kind of an interesting empirical question of, as we're looking at the potential of these different candidate feedback mechanisms to drive alternative stable states, when we're looking at some of these community level features in a really diverse system, like average feeding or average recruitment, to what extent does it depend on diversity versus just total consumer abundance, right? So if it's mostly consumer abundance, then it's kind of a more system with more redundant species roles and a greater potential for alternative stable states. The other thing to point out here is that the many different mechanisms that affect feeding, right, they lead to a case where species might be improving conditions in more unique ways. And so within that model dynamic, we see kind of really prominent regime shifts still, but we have fewer conditions leading to alternative stable states, so perhaps a lower potential for alternative stable states. And this is a really novel insight that you don't get from the same model when you're just looking at a pair of a resource and a consumer. Okay, so this is really, and you're kind of aggregating and averaging across all the species. So this is really a novel dynamic that emerges when you account for this diversity of the species and their different demography within the consumer compartment. And so one of the really interesting questions is, what's kind of the simplest but biologically realistic model of this phenomenon that we can think of to kind of get a sense of how generally this might happen? And the last thing I want to point out is that we're kind of in many studies, we're starting to see this kind of really common trade-off between resistance and ecological resilience. Okay, so here we have systems that have higher functional redundancy between species. They can persist to a higher level of stress, but they also are the systems that have a greater potential for alternative stable states. Okay, so the key idea here is that with functional redundancy, you have the potential for all these species to help each other persist. You have really strong cross-species facilitation in a species cluster. But once you collapse that cluster, once those species collapse, it is very difficult to recover the system. And so this is something we've been seeing in models of community resistance to invasion. So all the hundreds of cichlid species in Lake Tanganyika and the invading Nile perch, and also in plant pollinator networks, so models of those with mutualism. So there's a couple of things this doesn't address yet. One thing is that with the way we model this is that the feedbacks affecting consumer feeding and recruitment basically affect all consumers. And so how much they affect them varies over a uniform distribution. In reality, maybe that distribution is bimodal. So some consumers really strongly experience that feedback and other species not at all. And so when we're modeling that, there's kind of a really interesting, it's really interesting to consider what are the biological trade-offs that can still limit the density of the species that aren't affected by the feedback. Then, of course, here we modeled the food web connectance, or the species, consumer resource interactions as being kind of static through time, that kind of connectance network. But of course, to some extent, consumers might be adjusting their preference to spending most of their time eating the most edible resources. Okay, so of course, this flexibility in diet is going to be constrained by things like nutrient needs and balancing stoichiometry, or if you have seasonality or spatial structure in resource availability. But these kinds of mechanisms might make feeding feedbacks more likely to produce alternative stable states. But potentially they might also increase competitive exclusion as everyone's kind of converging on the same resource. So some really interesting questions left over. And thank you. I'd love to discuss this.
Thank you very much, Vadim. So, if anybody has questions, the floor is yours. Either just go ahead, or in the participant list, just do a raise hand, and I will be looking at that. Go ahead. Any questions?
Maybe I'll ask, because, well, some of it went a bit fast because they don't give you a lot of time. So I was really interested in the conclusion of this redundancy, increasing resilience, but also the likelihood of alternative steady states. Can you elaborate a little bit more on that point, on the work you have? Yeah, I mean, maybe because you said you have looked at that in other contexts and so on. So I wonder whether you can say a little bit more about that point.
Yeah. So typically we're thinking about, in most of the models, both the simple models and a lot of the multi-species models we've done, we're actually thinking about systems where species have more kind of redundant roles. So they're all kind of helping alleviate the same stressor. Okay, and so then what's basically just really important is the overall, so in this case, the overall abundance of consumers, right? Total abundance, how abundant each individual species isn't really important. So that creates a condition where you can have a really large potential for species facilitating each other. So you can have a really strong facilitative feedback that promotes persistence. When species have more kind of specialized roles, then you have the problem that persistence of the whole community might really depend on having each of several different species present there. And when species differ from one another, there's a greater chance that one of those really important key species that's doing a key role, providing like a key limiting nutrient, that as you increase stress, that species goes extinct first. So you're increasing the chance that the whole community relies on a really vulnerable species.
Okay, thank you. Are there any other questions? There's plenty of time for questions.
Vadim, I think you touched on this at the end, but the notion of rewiring when you lose a species, how much have you looked at that? Some notion of, say, sort of building a connectance network with some sort of optimal foraging dynamics in response to abundance of different species.
So that would be kind of a really interesting next step. And thinking about how much that can happen, right? What are the biological constraints and how much that can happen? but yeah, presumably, like, yeah, if you have this kind of dynamic rewiring, you might have a greater potential or kind of less unique species contributions because the species roles are changing as you're rewiring the network. Yeah, so that could yeah, change some of these conclusions, and that would be really interesting to look at.
Okay, so I mean, in the context of what you've done, how do you frequently observe situations where you think where rewiring might have a big effect? That is, do you frequently see species going extinct in a cascade because their particular food has gone away and they haven't switched to something else? Or is that sort of a rare event?
So yeah, I haven't spent a lot of time looking at that, but kind of visualize how if you're close to the collapse point and you remove some key species, this is kind of what the dynamics look like. And yeah. So here we're removing this kind of key consumer species, and the blue lines are the resources that it's really focusing on. Okay, so first we see kind of an increase in that key resource that it was using, and then the other kind of resources start ticking up as well, and then the other species start going out.
Yeah.
But yeah, this is a really kind of constant interaction network. Yeah.
Right. Okay.
So yeah, here you see these kind of cascades of extinction with the recruitment feedbacks. Well, once you take out the critical species, you have kind of this more synchronized collapse of the whole community.
Hi, this is Bob Holt. That was very nice, Dr. Karatayev. I've really enjoyed it. I have two questions for you. One is you started out by talking about our familiar, few species models, 3 species and so forth, before going to many species. But I would think that these same phenomena could show up with relatively few species, depending upon how similar their traits are and so forth. So that's my first observation. And that's useful then, because then you can really analytically understand maybe what's going on, how it relates to criteria that come out of coexistence theory and so forth.
Yeah, exactly.
And the second is, I don't see anything inherent here that distinguishes across species variability versus genetic variability within a species, where if you have positive feedbacks, I mean, species individuals within a species are likely to be quite similar in their impacts upon the world. And if you have these positive feedbacks, maybe you get alternative states in the genetic composition of populations. So that's just a quick thought.
Yeah, that is really, really interesting, actually. I haven't spent as much time thinking about evolution as I should, but yeah. Yeah, it's a little bit different because all the different producing with each other. So there's kind of.
But if you were talking about, what counts as a species in microbial organisms is, if they're clonal and they're just lineages of related individuals, they're not necessarily mating with each other very much. So anyway, it's just a thought that something that would be interesting to look at. And what about the going from few species to many? I mean, can you see all these effects with 4 species, for instance, or 3, or do you need 80?
Yeah, so I think that the key thing that you'll see with kind of intermediate diversity systems is that you'll just have kind of more, some of these patterns will start to get muddier, right? So you'll have more context dependency in what particular species you have in terms of their traits, in terms of what they're eating. And you're kind of more likely to see kind of things where you have like just one really dominant species and everything is kind of relying on whether that one is present or not, and things like that. So you'll get kind of more context specificity, I think.
Mm-hmm.
But
okay, thank you. Other questions? Anyone? Feel free to also raise your hand in the chat if you think of a question while somebody's speaking, and then I'll take note of that. Please go ahead. While people are thinking, I would have a question actually, Vadim. It's very simple. So what are the rules for determining your food web topology in the model, and does it matter?
Yes. So the food web topology is, or the kind of the algorithm is that you just kind of randomly assign species interactions. So which ones are present and absent. Then you assign kind of the strength of each interaction, and that kind of it goes from a log normal distribution. And then you make sure that all the interactions for each consumer species kind of add up to 1. Okay, and then we have fixed species level differences in grazing rates.
So sorry, that's how you keep the mean interaction strength fixed.
Exactly, across connectance levels. Yeah. So that's the feeding part of it. Then we kind of set up the rest of the food web with drawing species traits from uniform distributions. So there's also a network that says for recruitment feedbacks, which consumer is impacted by which, its recruitment is impacted by which resource species. Mm-hmm. With feeding feedbacks, of course, that's perfectly reciprocal. Mm-hmm. For recruitment, it could be potentially different. So if a fish species recruits on one part of the reef and then grazes on another one and a different part. And so once you put all that together, you can kind of simulate the food web dynamic at a low mortality level and check that you actually have most of the consumer species present there.
So did you have like a strict criterion that every species has to be present, or just good enough?
Yeah, so within, yeah, all the species have to be present above a certain density threshold. Mm-hmm.
And I did understand correctly that these are 2 strict trophic levels. So the network is bipartite.
Yes, exactly.
Yeah, thanks. Okay. Yeah, that was it. Thank you. Yes, other questions? Anyone?
This might be a bit of a naive question in some ways, but can you draw across a kind of general rule that from your models that just simpler communities, no matter how you measure simplicity, are more likely to exhibit these alternative stable states? Or is that too simplistic an interpretation of what's going on here? Like, for example, in this pattern of trophic interactions, if you made the kind of communities more similar to each other, maybe introducing some sort of trait axis or something, so they kind of matched and not totally random, would that sort of thing, like, can you make assumptions like beyond that based on that?
Yeah, I think there's a there's a very clear argument that, yeah, if you have just a really simple T-species system, these kinds of things are much more likely to happen, right? So both of these feedbacks are likely to drive alternative stable states, because then basically all members of a species are playing the same role in the feedback, right? You just you don't have any kind of you're less likely to have this kind of specialization. So with less diversity, you have kind of really truly these kind of 2 big compartments. You can have really strong the feedback loop between them can be quite strong. It's not getting spread out across different species. Yes.
Yes, other questions? Please go ahead.
Well, maybe connected to that, if there are some specific comparisons here that looking back at the systems where we have observed some evidence for these alternative steady states, like the Caribbean coral reef collapses, or some of these kelp systems, how would you, are there some specific comparisons in the kinds of interactions, the kinds of feedbacks, etc., that predominate, or the kind of redundancy? So what kinds of empirical comparisons would be useful to test some of your some of your findings? I mean, are you at a level where you can isolate some of those predictions that perhaps in a comparative way could be tested? Or
yeah, so yeah, one of the challenges here, when you're looking at a really diverse system is with kind of applying these insights is asking like these kinds of questions for the community level features that are involved in the feedback. So either feeding average ability across resources or average recruitment across consumers. To what extent does it depend just on total abundance, or to what extent do species have like complementary roles? Those are, that would take quite a bit of work. And I think in some systems, you might be able to like exclude different herbivore species on a coral reef and look at what happens, but you still need kind of a fairly large exposure. I think so there's kind of basically a lot of empirical work that we need to do to kind of, with measuring the strength of different kind of feedbacks in these really diverse systems to get at, do we really see this kind of distinction empirically? The key application I was kind of had in mind with this is, so one of the problems is that when we're thinking about resilience in some of these really diverse systems like coral reefs, or I've done a lot of work with kelp forests, is that there's a really, really long list of potential feedback loop mechanisms that could explain alternative stable states. And so I think one of the emphasis here is that when we're talking about kind of, for instance, collapse of herbivore species on a coral reef, of all these different potential candidate feedback mechanisms, the ones we want to kind of prioritize first are the ones where species kind of have more similar roles, right? So we have greater redundancy in how species help each other persist within that mechanism. Okay, and so specifically with food webs, these are things, mechanisms related to consumer recruitment.
I have if nobody else has a question, I've got another one I'd like to ask. I should.
Please.
So the kind of positive effects that you're talking about have to do with kind of effects on bottom-up availability of resources. I was wondering if the same thing might happen from a top-down perspective. And what I'm thinking of here are the many examples in many different biomes of, for instance, mixed species flocks of birds or mixed species schools of fish, where they aggregate together and they have a reduction in a stressor, namely predation pressure from above. And so I was wondering if you could find analogous phenomena. Shared positive effect on the world is via alleviation of top-down effects in food webs.
Yeah, so yeah, that's a really great point. So usually we're kind of concerned about, in many cases, like over exploiting top consumers in a food web. And so we're concerned with consumer collapse, but your two states are consumer and resource, or only the resource, right? And in some cases, we actually want the opposite. So the really great example is Lake Tanganyika and the Nile perch that was invading there. So you have these hundreds of cichlid species that were all, one of the key things that we're doing was eating the perch while they were young, so the larvae and the eggs. And so one of the things we think that might have happened there is you have kind of this overexploitation of the cichlid species, and that's left a big enough gap for a lot of the, for enough of the Nile perch young to survive. Then you have lots of predators, and then the perch hammer down the cichlids. And that was particularly one of these kinds of recruitment feedbacks, right? Where you have all the different, many different cichlid species all kind of going after the larvae of this invasive predator. I think you might have very similar dynamics when you're thinking about plant communities and resistance to invasion, right? Maybe you have a dominant invader, but perhaps as a seedling, they're less kind of, they are less dominant, or they're kind of more susceptible to competition from natives. And so then if you have these kind of really small local invasions, maybe the community can push these kind of invaders out locally, and you have kind of these issues of demographic stochasticity. If you kind of have a really big stress applied to the native grass community, then you leave a lot of kind of holes for the invader to come in. Yeah, so you have kind of these very analogous, just thinking the other way of questions of invasion, yeah, with invasive consumers.
Thank you. Anybody else with questions? While people are thinking, sorry, I actually wanted to follow up on something, on the thing I was asking, just to make sure. So you said that you filled out the interaction magnitudes from a log normal distribution. So did you play with the distribution and see what kind of effect it has? Like, is it such that, say, the phenomenon of alternative stable states is robust, but where exactly the transition happens and how sensitive to parameterization, or is there anything like that that you were looking at?
Yes, it's not very sensitive to the variance in that distribution. Yeah, that doesn't really make much difference. Yeah, and in large part, the variance is just kind of a thing to for biological realism, and also kind of it helps with the coexistence of different consumer species in this context.
So this phenomenon would also work if you would just do the simplest kind of thing and assign equal strengths everywhere.
Yeah, as long as you have kind of the mechanism to allow consumer species to coexist. Yeah.
Okay. Yeah. Oh, yeah. Of course. Thanks. Yeah. Other questions? Yes, Steve.
Yeah. Can we go back to slide 6 for a minute?
Mm-hmm.
It just occurred to me while that was up on the screen for a while that the phrase abundant resources deplete recruitment runs counter to everything we teach our students when we're teaching them a basic ecology class. It features in none of the models that we present, none of the theory that we present. Are we making a mistake? Do you think that we're leaving out a really important ecological phenomenon when we don't include the possibility that the availability of too much food is going to be a problem?
Yeah, so I think my response would be I would take a rain check on that and wait a little bit longer to see how, because theoretically this is true and can happen, but wait and see how commonly we find really strong empirical support for that process is really important within natural systems. But I think there's an overall message that we're sort of perhaps we're sort of to some extent underappreciating the role of species interactions in stage structured populations, right? And there's kind of a lot of kind of related phenomenon, like we often think about animal movement, and so we're looking at spatial populations and kind of questions of species invasions, where we're just tracking adults. But really, in many of these systems, what's doing the movement are seedlings or larvae, and again, with those kinds of things, when they're coming into a new community, they can be very sensitive to local environmental conditions. And so they can really change what the spatial dynamics look like. Again, you might have a really dominant invader, but as a seedling or as a larvae, it's kind of very weak in terms of invading. So you can get a much greater potential, for instance, for spatial patterning there. So yeah.
Okay, so I guess what you're talking about there is like some kind of analog of the Hydra effect, right? Where in state structured populations, you increase mortality and you get more individuals. Here, you increase resources, but in fact, the net recruitment goes down.
Exactly, yeah.
Yeah, okay, good, thanks.
If I could throw out a historical note, Steve and Vadim, Buzz Holling in his classic papers on functional responses in the 1950s, all the textbooks have 3 functional responses, linear, saturating, and sigmoidal, but he actually had a 4th, which is a hump-shaped functional response, where there can be so much food available that your feeding intake per predator goes down, and presumably the per capita growth rate goes down as well.
Okay.
So it's been around as a kind of a very minor theme in the literature for 70 years, but it hasn't really been paid much attention to.
Yeah, it sort of dropped out of what we talk about to our students.
That is really funny that you mentioned that, because my other thesis chapter was looking at urchin barrens and kelp forests and how urchins create urchin barrens.
Right.
And the underlying mechanism there, and this is a really kind of model-fitting, data-driven exercise, is essentially a type 4 interaction, that hump shape, where once you have lots of a really dense kelp stand, it either repels grazing or it provides all these kinds of indirect subsidies that urchins downregulate their grazing activity. So through that kind of type 4 interaction, that's actually, it looks like one of the key drivers of alternative stable states in kelp forests, and it's kind of all mediated by urchin behavior. But yeah.
Yeah, do we have any other questions? Well, in case we don't have any more questions, but do prove me wrong if you do, so let me know if you do. But it seems no, we don't have any more questions. In that case, thank you so much, Vadim, for the very interesting talk. And thank you everyone for coming to our talk today. Don't forget that we're going to continue with this series, and in 2 weeks, it's going to be Camille Carpentier presenting about a new link species relationship connecting robustness and resilience metrics. Beware the time, those of you who are from Europe, because I believe they are going to adjust times in the US while they're not going to adjust times in Europe. Therefore, we're always anchoring the time to 9 a.m. Pacific time. And I believe in Europe so in 2 weeks from now, it's going to be at 5 p.m. as opposed to 6 p.m. in Central European time zone. So anyway, just be mindful of that. Oops, is there a, oh no, sorry. Sorry, I just saw the virtual clapping and I was wondering if that's a raised hand. Very easy to mistake for one another, but no. So I completely agree with that sentiment. So thank you very much, Vadim. And again, don't forget, in 2 weeks, we hope to see you all in that. So thank you very much, and I hope to see you all soon.